Welcome to Praise Hands, home of the Praise Hands, where we are all about creative, cross-cultural Christianity. I'm your host, Robbie Valderrama. Welcome to the last episode of Season 3. As the COVID-19 pandemic unfolded, many of us Americans learned what it's like to live each day wondering if one wrong move might cost us our lives. But for many in the Black community and in law enforcement, this feeling was already all too familiar. In light of the violent deaths of Black male Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia and police officer Michael Mosher in Kansas, it's natural to mourn, pray, and also wonder, what can we do to make our communities safer? To answer this question, I sat down with award-winning virtual reality designer and storyteller Derek Ham. As an African-American male in the tech industry, his I Am a Man VR experience has won awards across the country and is currently being used to increase mutual empathy between people of color and law enforcement. On a recent trip to Silicon Valley, I had a chance to demo this virtual reality experience firsthand, and that video is available for all monthly supporters of this podcast. You can sign up to become a monthly supporter and view the video at praisehands.com/donate. Without further ado, let's jump on in. Derek.
Hey.
Thanks for being on the Praise Hands podcast.
Yes.
Man,
Nice to be here.
what an experience. I just got to experience your I Am a Man VR exhibit. It's really kind of like a new media form, almost like an interactive documentary.
Yes. For me, what I love about this medium is what you can do with the amount of agency that you give the viewer. If you
Right.
think about a film, I'm doing cut shots, so I'm controlling what you're looking at. So as soon as we go to virtual reality, I can't control the cut scenes.
Right.
However, what I can do in VR, if you notice you had these hands of a Black man, you can't escape that.
Right.
So it's this interesting swap
Yeah,
where it's
right.
like, okay, you have the agency to look anywhere you want to,
Right.
but you can't escape who you are in the role and the story that's being unfolded there. So that's a kind of interesting thing when we start thinking
Right,
about
right.
that agency, control, directors, and all of that.
Yeah. Oftentimes, our perspective, or in some cases our biases, are very formed by who we believe ourselves to be, and also who we don't believe ourselves to be.
Yes.
And that can actually prevent us from seeing a holistic reality that's more true than the sliver of what we've experienced. And what's interesting about this experience is it, for a moment, displaces that ontology and doesn't allow you to lock into just the narrative that you've been given, and forces you to deal with a different narrative
Yes.
than the one that you've necessarily been handed.
Yes. And I was trying to do that by placing you kind of in the shoes and the body of a sanitation worker, not allowing you to escape with the idea that should pop in your mind. What was these events like for those people, people other than yourself? We all have lens in which we look through history. We look through the history of our culture, of our gender, all of that. But then as soon as I put you into, okay, a Black man in America, and now a Black man in America in 1968, as those events roll through, you can't escape that.
Yeah.
And I love that puts you in check. And if there's one thing we need to do more of, right, is we need to stop and say, what is it like to view the world through someone else, our neighbor's eyes?
Right, right. Why do you think that it's so difficult for us to do that?
It takes work to allow yourself to kind of go through those things. If we remove virtual reality and you're looking at a picture, or we're in such a fast-paced medium, a blog post or something that pops up on Twitter, you can either respond to that photo, or you can be in such a quick pace and it's like, okay, that interests me or it doesn't, so we go through. The work that it takes to share empathy or to share someone else's view, one, it requires you to slow down and think about that person's perspective, their background, that slow pace in which you have to enter into to do that exercise. Whereas a society that everything's fast paced and so ego self-centered. So you put those together, of course you're going to have a lot less empathy.
Talk to me about your experience as a black man in America today.
You want to throw the lens of Christianity on there too?
Yeah,
Let's make it
yeah, please. Yeah. So tell us, what's it like to be Derek Ham in the world today?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that I hope the VR experience captures about what was happening there and what's happening still today. There's a sense of frustration. And I think hopefully you captured that as soon as Dr. King was assassinated. And there's a scene where you look and there's other men in the street. And I try to capture their emotions and their response to that news. It's just frustration of like, imagine you're climbing towards something and something just like big blow knocks it back down. So here we are again. We'll keep running, we keep working towards something, and boom, something resurfaces or something. What
was that thing that Martin Luther King Jr. was running towards? Can you put words to that?
Yeah, so for Dr. King, at this point in his life, he had fought for the right to vote, right? So there was a push for that. And remember, this is a period of time where other great leaders were being assassinated or killed. Medgar Evers was assassinated. Malcolm X assassinated.
Robert Kennedy.
So you have these people who are trying to do things, and this opposition force seems almost just unyielding, always pushing back, never saying, let's all come together and go in that direction. So when I was doing the research on this project, which required me to dig deeper in the history instead of just the stuff that's pandered in front of us every Black History Month, the same photos, like, let's dive a little bit deeper.
Right.
Surprisingly, there's a lot of people who don't even know the I Am Man campaign that was for the sanitation workers, or Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign that he was running at that time, right before his assassination. So when I'm looking at all this, and I'm looking at this kind of world which was trying to move to a certain direction, and this crazy radical opposition against something where if you look on the surface, you would think, we don't all want these things. Where is this crazy opposition coming from? In a lot of ways, some of the things I see in America today, some of the rhetoric, some of the hate, is that crazy opposition. And that's, for me, is very frustrating. It's like, where is this coming from? Why is that opposition still there, still pushing? Why is white supremacy still a thing into 2020? How is it that I can drive through Southern America and see proud Confederate flags, proudly holding on to a history that was troubled, that was riddled with racism, riddled with all types of vices? How could we in 2020 be holding that? So for me, it's a frustration that I tried to capture in that experience. And I think a lot of my peers today are still, when they see things happening, there's a sense of frustration of just like, what, again? Another, another black male shot again without a gun on him? What, again? Like, that's frustrating for me, thinking about where I thought 2020 would be when I was like a 7-year-old kid, So that's like a snapshot of my kind of understanding of the parallel between looking at developing this I'm a Man project situated in 1968 to our America today. As a tech developer in VR, one of the things that stands out for me that's challenging is being able to do a project like this, an immersive project that tells history, and getting backlash for telling this type of history, right? There were some comments that are like, oh, you're exciting racism. It's almost like by telling the story, you're making things worse. To say the way forward, we should forget. That once again brings up for me the word frustration, because if you turn the history over to, for instance, World War II, you can tell a story about Pearl Harbor. You can tell tons of movies about Pearl Harbor. And no one, you don't see Japanese Americans being angry, or no one saying, oh, stop talking about this. It's like, no, let's talk about the heroism, these soldiers, America's greatest generations do that. And then you fold the paper over and you look at the heroes, such as sanitation workers or those who stood up for civil rights. And there's a voice that says, why do we have to talk about that still? Why are we still telling those stories? Can't have it both ways. History is history. So when I want to tell my history and use this technology in a way to tell this history, I'm just baffled that voice even exists out there to say, don't tell that history, or to suggest that telling this history leads to the problem. That somehow the path forward is to forget and don't even tell these stories. So that becomes a really interesting thing. And as a person dealing in VR, I have a broad body of work, and not everything is this content.
Right.
And that presents yet even another challenge where there are some that would only want to receive you to the VR table if you're telling that type of story.
Sure.
And then there are others that will acknowledge your other contributions to it. So I feel very blessed that even in this project that it was received across a wide audience of storytellers, of VR producers, of film producers, and so that it wasn't pigeonholed. But
and you won some awards for it.
I won some awards for it.
Was it Oculus's
Launchpad program? I won an AT&T Film Award for it, Nashville Film Festival, and something called the Future of Storytelling. So it has been received very well. But when I start thinking about the next project, that becomes one of those questions about what do you want to do, where I land, right?
Yeah. So one of the ways that this documentary has been used is in actual conversations between law enforcement and people of color in communities. And one of the things that we like to highlight is creative cross-cultural solutions.
Yes.
And like you mentioned, there is a lot of frustration around this issue. And what I appreciate about what you're doing is you funneled that into something meaningful that's changing the conversation, that is a tool for reconciliation as opposed to just an outlet for frustration.
Right.
And there's a big difference because one is productive and constructive and the other isn't always.
Yes.
And so walk me through how this has been used.
So one of the things that came up was, what if we could allow community members and police officers in the communities that they serve trade places just to share a different perspective? And I was working with a nonprofit group called Equality Labs who presented this model to say, hey, can we use I'm a Man in this way? And the idea is you take one virtual reality experience, I'm a Man, you take another virtual reality experience called Dispatch, and that team that made that has won their own awards for that type of project. It puts you in the shoes, if you will, of what it's like to be responding to a 911 call. And all the challenges and all the unknown variables it takes for officers to come to the scene of a crime. So you put the community members into Dispatch, and even for myself, there's a pause. Hollywood glorifies everything. We don't realize the person who receives it, they're blind going into this. They're relying on the audible cues that are going on in the background. They're asking questions. They're trying to keep the people calm and their self. So there's a lot of unknown variables. And then pulling up to the crime scene, it could be a prankster or it could be something more dangerous than they could ever imagine. So to be able to capture the essence of that, and for someone who's not in law enforcement to pause to say, wait, this is not an easy decision when you come to the scene of a crime. Not all of them are trigger happy, just ready to go and guns blazing. They're processing all this stuff. And then for the officers, for them to try I'm a Man, they can begin to put together these kind of years and years of oppression and racism that's been in this country, so they can see in parallel some of this frustration that has existed well for over 50 years, well, almost hundreds of years. So it's great for us to use VR for us to do that, but it doesn't stop there. I like to think of it, what happens outside of the headset is where the real power begins. And to facilitate small groups, to have conversations, and to allow the VR to be a catalyst for a new type of dialogue, that's where we've seen I'm a Man being used and being piloted for such programs.
So if a police station gets together and a local community, what sort of conversations would you want to see happening out of that?
Well, one, not just a conversation, hopefully to see listening, listening with new ears, coming out and say, you know, as a police officer talks, I'm going to be receptive and I'm going to listen. And for the police officers to put down their defense, coming out and say, wow, I'm ready to listen now. I think the listening aspect of the community conversation is just as important as what's being said. And then as people are talking, these things are tried and have been piloted in very small, intimate groups. Trust has been built and they're ready to have a conversation, to just be able to be transparent, to say, this is my frustration. I've seen people cry through these sessions, and being able to be vulnerable, to say, this is how I'm feeling. If I'm an officer, this is how I'm feeling. In some cases, some of them feeling like the nation nation is against them, and they're all painted as villains when their work is hard. They're not getting paid that much. Community member feeling like the target's on them always, as a black man being able to walk in the street and kind of feel like, wait a second, I'm viewed as a suspect before anything has ever happened. But we've had those conversations already in community groups. I think the difference with this project is it makes you now a better listener, and to be able to say, let me pause, because I'm going to listen as if I'm in their shoes. So let me pause and listen. And that's where oftentimes we just don't see enough listening.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is contributing to this conversation in terms of the misunderstanding about police forces and the role of policing in a democratic society is the role that police have in different neighborhoods is vastly different. And the perception is also vastly different. I can drive through a neighborhood. We're here today in San Jose, California. I can walk through this neighborhood and go down the street, drive around. I don't feel like the police are out to get me. It doesn't feel like there's this culture of like maybe overly militarized or anything. It's just, like if you need something, you call and they show up.
Right.
When I go to other places in the country or other neighborhoods, it feels like almost like a war zone. And it feels like if I make one misstep, I'm going to be on the wrong side of something. And it's hard to overstate how different those experiences feel. And I think that's part of the difficulty is when people from those different backgrounds are referring to the police. They're actually referring to something different.
Something unique to a particular neighborhood or part of the country or where that is. And I think that's where some of the frustration of the officers have is that you want to paint everyone as bad racist cops. And that's just not true. And if you stop and listen, that's the same argument that I have. I'm a black man walking down the street, just a man walking down the street. Don't label me before you have a conversation with me or just assume the worst as soon as you see. So just as if I expect officers not to assume the worst when they see me, I shouldn't freak out every time I see blue. But we can't do that until we start having that conversation.
That's powerful. So in terms of your Christian faith and in terms of how that relates to technology, what have you seen that's caused you to chart a path that really there probably aren't a lot of people in front of you in that path that have blazed ahead?
Well, I mean, technology is just a tool at the end of the day, and it comes in a lot of different forms. And I think the key is for us to be creative with a purpose. You know, I look at the life of Dr. King, and not just him, the civil rights workers. They had to be creative for a purpose, for a mission. They were mission-minded. They wanted to change the world. And so for me to say, how can I harness my creativity? And if it comes through the use of technology, in this case it does, I have to use that. And I think if you're truly a Christian and you truly want to live out the ideals and the path that Christ lived for you, then you have to stand up for justice. You have to be a voice for the disenfranchised. You have to use your tools, if you will, not just to make profit for yourselves, but to better other people and to be a witness and to be a light. And so for me, I don't see any escaping of how my life lined up for me to do a project like I'm a Man. For me, I feel it's like it's an answer. It's like I was supposed to do that type of project at that time, even though I did not see the use of it with police and communities. That for me was very fulfilling to see that came out. I was like, well, whoever sees it, I have to go out and maybe show it to them or do the festival route. But as soon as that opportunity happened, I was like, you know, that's providence. Like, I'm glad I answered the call and did this project because it could have never been used in these types of ways.
That's powerful.
One of the things that is a potential still open is for more musicians to get into virtual reality. And this project, it happened that only the last song was a piece that I was able to meet the artists. And Miss Mary Williams, she did that last hymn, and when you're sitting in Dr. King's hotel, it happened to be that was a commercial royalty-free song. It's well known. So she had already recorded it on an album. So being able to meet her and tell her about the project and do that. But there are so many other moments in there, and this type of work is, I think, really rich opportunity for some of the artists in the world who are in music to team up with storytellers to say we can use this in a more powerful way in ways we've never seen before. And so the other songs, yes, I took a lot of time. I looked through libraries, and I had to require rights for songs that I wanted to use. But at the end, I would have loved to see in the future of my work more one-to-one collaboration with musicians and this type of work.
Yeah, for sure. So if people are listening to this and you're a musician, we'll put in the show notes how you can get a hold of Derek. So furthering on the theme of this virtual reality and really of maybe even gaming and screen-related activities in general, there have been a lot of conversations about whether or not playing violent video games has been tied to mass shootings and things like that. Right. And I haven't seen any comprehensive studies that have shown there's a direct link. Right. There have been studies, and I think the American Psychological Association has done work on this, that it's linked to aggressive behavior. Right. And so to use terminology that Dr. King and Gandhi, who both were inspired by Jesus, would use in this nonviolent direct action route, what's interesting to me is the flip. A lot of the future, what a lot of people predict about virtual reality is in violent, shooter games. Yeah. And where a lot of profit can be made in those spaces. But what you're doing through this project is a nonviolent expression where you're using this in a more productive way. And that, I think, echoes the stance that Dr. King took to actually produce action. So in the same way, you're channeling that same nonviolent lineage to be able to produce, hopefully, a similar result.
Well, let me ask you a question. Yeah. I saw you turn around and you picked up, there's a scene when the men are marching down the street and you saw the signs and you picked up both signs. How did you feel at that very moment when you picked up the signs?
I wanted to go and march with the other people.
So it tapped into something. It gave you a desire. You felt call to action. I think there's a seed there. I've watched that moment hundreds of times. I've seen people look at the signs, reach for it, and then pull back and ask them afterwards why. They said, I'm not sure if I felt worthy, if I would stand up for this. Wrestling with emotions. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting how we could use gaming technology to tap into an emotional response and give you this this charged energy. What other ways could we do that in gaming and storytelling that isn't about the rush of picking up a bow and arrow and firing it, or a gun and shooting the enemy, and that obviously releases dopamine rushes and you're doing that. Could we potentially do acts of nonviolence or acts of charity, acts of benevolence in VR, role-playing through game, and giving you still a rush? That's a question I have. And I think that moment, building the story to the sign there to say, I'm going to join these marchers, is a potential seed of toying out moments in storytelling and gameplay that have nothing to do with violence, but still excites you and brings you to that edge.
Wow, that's really powerful. Yeah. Wow. So for creators of any sort of solution, whether it's technological, something that they're having to really step out in faith and create something out of nothing, really, can you speak to that process and honestly even to the funding side of things? How would you recommend, if somebody's got this dream for a project or something like that, what is a good next step for them?
So when I was doing I'm a Man, I knew I wanted to tell the story. And I was honest with what I could do with the resources, with limited resources, and limited time, and thinking about everything. So I feel thankful that it went as far as it was going to be. But had I not gotten the resources, I tiered the project. I said, well, if I don't have this much money and I can't buy the rights to some of those photos, it's going to have to be told without the photo part of it. If it doesn't have the rights for this music, well, here's this other track. That's what it doesn't sound as good. So I would say, you have a vision, but then tier it with the lowest hanging fruit. I think everybody can do something. And I think oftentimes you can derail yourself if you say, no, I just have the big vision. And if I don't execute that big one, I will just do nothing. It's like all sticks or nothing. I say, no, you can build up. You can start at a low level. So if you are into film, you know, you can grab that phone and start shooting and start editing and say, this is my little pet baby project, and it tells a story, and you grow and you tier it. So that's how I thought about it. And there were some risk taking during that process. I reached out to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis and drove out there myself and showed it to them, was able to bring them on as a partner. And just different stages that were little wins as I kept going. And thankfully, it was the Oculus Launchpad program that gave me the main source of funds that allowed me to do everything that was needed for I'm a Man. Rights to photos, rights to music, time for myself to do all the coding and the editing and all of that. And so it does take a lot of work, but at the end of the day, feel passionate about it, and then practically speaking, build that list for yourself. If I have 0 funds or whatever the smallest pot of funds, and if you have this much time, what could I do with that thing? And I think that's part of being creative. When I see really creative projects, you know, they say necessity is the mother of invention. And so when you see gritty projects and really creative, oftentimes there are people that don't have the resources.
They didn't do it that way because they wanted to. It's like that's what they had.
And then if you flip the scales and you like have this like $1 million budget, oftentimes those are the projects where like they had so much money. What did you really do? So I say, you know, get into that aggressive, creative experience. My dad is a minister, and he'll be the first to say, like, you know, David had the stones, he had a sling, and he's like, what can I do with just these things? I think God has all blessed us to take raw materials, simple, crude things, and turn them into beautiful things. And so that would be my piece of advice. It's like, put that vision on a piece of paper, and then write down what do you need to do the biggest part of it. But if today was the only day you had and the only resources you had, could you still do something? And I would always say, yes, there is.
Yeah, that's amazing. Wow, well, I'm inspired. I love the risks that you've taken, and I love how much impact this has already had, and I look forward to hearing what your next projects may be. How can people learn more about you and the work that you're doing?
So I do have a website, derekham.com, but most of my energy where I feed most of my ideas is straight on my Twitter account, and I can be reached at Derek A. Ham on Twitter, and I'm sure you could share that with people. One of the things that I work in parallel is I have a startup that's with technology and VR peripherals, and these peripherals unlock storytelling and allow you to have different user interactions. So now I'm looking to say, well, what's the limit of what I can do in VR? And then how can these new devices unlock and allow me to do new things, to tell new stories? So I'm kind of excited to see how Parallel has the technology involved, how it opens new realms of storytelling.
Right. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, thank you for being on the show today.
Thanks, man. Glad to be here. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in, friends. As a reminder, all monthly supporters of this podcast will receive access to an inside look at Derek's I Am a Man VR experience. Sign up now to become a monthly supporter and view the video at praisehands.com/donate. If you have a guest you'd like to see interviewed on the Praise Hands podcast, or you'd just like to connect, drop us a note at praisehandspodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Over these first 3 seasons, I've so appreciated every time you've listened, shared, given to this cause. We couldn't do this without you, and we'll see you right back here for season 4.